He thought humiliating her would be entertainment. But the moment she stepped inside, the outcome had already changed, though no one in that room knew it yet. The shooting range buzzed with the low hum of conversations, the scent of oil and metal lingering in the air as men lined up confidently in their lanes, comparing scores, adjusting gear, proving something only they seemed to understand. And then Claire Whitman walked in, quiet, unannounced, wearing nothing that demanded attention. No polished boots, no tactical branding, just a simple jacket, faded jeans, and a calm expression that didn't try to belong, which was exactly why it stood out. Brandon Cole noticed her immediately, not because she was loud, but because she wasn't, and in a place built on noise and performance, silence looked out of place. He leaned back against the counter, arms folded, watching her approach like he had already made up his mind about her. "You here for directions?" he said, his voice cutting through the room just enough to turn a few heads. A couple of men nearby chuckled under their breath, not out of cruelty, but habit. Claire didn't react, didn't flinch. She simply stepped forward and signed her name on the clipboard, her handwriting steady, unhurried, like she had done it 1,000 times before. Brandon smirked, pushing off the counter, following her movement with a kind of casual arrogance that had never been challenged. "Just so you know," he added, louder now, "this isn't a place for guessing." More eyes turned, curiosity spreading like a ripple. Someone in the back leaned in, whispering something that ended with a quiet laugh. Claire reached the lane, placing her bag down gently, her movements efficient, minimal. She didn't look around, didn't scan the room for approval or attention, and somehow that made the room notice her even more. Brandon stepped closer, picking up a blindfold from the counter as if the idea had just formed, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Tell you what," he said, tossing it lightly onto the surface in front of her. "We make this interesting." The word interesting lingered in the air, drawing in the attention of everyone within earshot. Phones subtly lifted, shoulders angled for a better view. 10 shots, he continued, tapping the counter once. No sight. A pause, just long enough for the implication to settle. "Let's see what happens, eh?" Few quiet laughs followed. But there was something else now too, something sharper. Anticipation. Claire's eyes lowered briefly to the blindfold, her fingers brushing against the fabric, not hesitant, not eager, just present. And in that small, almost invisible moment, something shifted, though no one could explain it. Brandon waited, expecting resistance, maybe an excuse, maybe a polite decline, but Claire simply picked it up, turning it once in her hands before looking up, her gaze steady, unbothered. 10 shots, she repeated softly, as if confirming terms rather than accepting a challenge. And for the first time, Brandon's smile didn't grow, it paused, just slightly, like something deep inside him wasn't entirely convinced anymore. The room leaned in without realizing it, conversations fading, movements slowing, and somewhere in that growing silence, the game that had started as a joke quietly became something else entirely, something none of them were prepared to understand. And as Claire stood there, calm, composed, untouched by the weight of their expectations, one truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting, unseen, that sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't the weakest, but the one who already knows exactly how this will end. The blindfold rested in her hands for a fraction longer than expected, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring something no one else in that room could see: the subtle hum of the ventilation system, the faint shift of air across the lanes, the quiet rhythm of movement behind her. Claire Whitman tied the fabric around her eyes with deliberate precision, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to remove sight and nothing more. Brandon Cole watched closely, his posture still confident, but no longer careless. "You sure about this?" he said, his tone lighter now, almost testing, as if offering her a final exit that would confirm everything he believed about her. A few people leaned in closer. One man lowered his phone slightly. Waiting, Claire adjusted her stance without answering, her feet aligning naturally with the lane, shoulders relaxed, arms loose at her sides. There was no performance in her movements, no attempt to impress, and that absence of effort made the moment feel heavier than it should have. Brandon gestured toward the firearm on the counter. "Standard 9mm, he said, his voice returning to a more professional cadence, but still carrying an edge. Nothing fancy. Claire reached forward, her hand finding it without hesitation, her fingers settling into place as if guided by memory rather than sight. Someone in the back whispered, "She is guessing." Another replied, "This is going to be bad." But the laughter did not follow this time. Instead, there was a tension building, quiet, uncertain. Claire lifted the firearm, not rushing, not pausing, just moving in a steady, controlled rhythm. Her breathing changed, slower now, deeper, as if the entire room had faded away. Brandon noticed it then. The shift, subtle but unmistakable. The way her posture aligned. The way her head tilted slightly, as if listening rather than aiming. "Whenever you are ready," he said, though his voice did not carry the same confidence it had moments ago. The room fell still. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the small mechanical sounds seemed to fade. And then the first shot rang out, clean, sharp, echoing through the space. A few people flinched, not from fear, but from the suddenness of it. Claire did not move after the shot. She held her position, exhaled slowly, then adjusted by a fraction. So small it was almost invisible. The second shot followed, then the third, each one separated by the same measured breath, not rushed, not delayed, like a rhythm that had been practiced long before this moment existed. Brandon's eyes flicked toward the target screen, but no one had checked yet. It was too early, too uncertain. By the fourth shot, the energy in the room had changed completely. No one was smiling now. No one was whispering. They were watching, waiting, trying to understand what they were seeing. Claire continued, each movement minimal, efficient, her focus untouched by the weight of their attention. And somewhere deep in that silence, something began to settle into place, not just for her, but for everyone in that room. The realization that this was no longer a joke, that whatever they had expected when she walked in had already begun to unravel. And as the fifth shot echoed and faded into the stillness, Brandon felt it clearly for the first time. Not doubt, but something sharper, something quieter, the unsettling sense that he was no longer in control of what was happening, and that whatever came next would not belong to him at all. The sixth shot came without hesitation, carried on the same steady breath that had guided the first five, and by now the sound itself had changed in the ears of everyone listening. It no longer startled, it measured, it counted, it marked something unfolding that no one had predicted. Claire Whitman remained perfectly still between each movement, her posture untouched by pressure, her focus anchored somewhere deeper than sight. And in that stillness the room found itself holding back, as if any noise might disrupt something precise and fragile. Brandon Cole stood just behind her line, his arms no longer crossed, his weight shifted forward slightly, his eyes locked not on her, but on the distant target screens that had yet to reveal anything. He wanted to speak, to break the tension, to reclaim the moment with a joke or a comment, but the words did not come, because something about the way she moved had already taken that option away. The seventh shot followed, clean and controlled, and a man near the back instinctively stepped closer to the monitor, then stopped himself, as if afraid to look too soon. Whispers that had once carried amusement were now reduced to fragments. "There is no way," someone murmured. Another voice answered, "She is not guessing." And that realization settled heavily across the room. Claire adjusted her grip by a fraction, the kind of correction that only came from repetition, from memory built over years rather than minutes. Her breathing remained unchanged, a quiet rhythm that seemed to guide everything else. The eighth shot rang out, and this time no one moved at all, not a shift of weight, not a clearing of the throat. The entire range had fallen into a silence so complete it felt deliberate, as if the space itself understood that something important was happening. Brandon swallowed, his confidence now replaced by a growing awareness he could not ignore. This was not luck, not coincidence, not a beginner's streak. This was control. And control like this did not appear by accident. Claire paused slightly longer before the ninth shot, not out of uncertainty, but precision, her head tilting just enough to align with something only she could sense. And in that moment a flicker of something passed through her expression, not emotion, but recognition, as if this space, this distance, this exact condition had existed for her long before today. The ninth shot echoed, and somewhere near the front A man exhaled sharply, realizing he had been holding his breath for far too long. Brandon's gaze snapped again toward the targets, his jaw tightening, the need to see now overwhelming everything else. But still no one checked, because they all understood that the final shot mattered more than the rest, that whatever truth was forming would reveal itself completely only at the end. Claire's fingers settled once more, her stance unchanged, her calm unbroken, and as she prepared for the 10th and final shot, the room leaned into the silence as one, drawn into a moment none of them could have anticipated, where judgment had already lost its place, and the only thing left was the quiet, undeniable question hanging in the air. Who had they been watching all along? The final moment did not rush. It stretched, suspended in a silence, so complete it felt like the entire room had been pulled into a single breath. Claire Whitman stood unmoving, the blindfold still covering her eyes, her fingers resting with quiet certainty, her posture untouched by the weight of expectation pressing in from every direction. Brandon Cole could feel it now, not just uncertainty, but the unmistakable shift of control slipping entirely out of his hands. The joke he had started no longer belonged to him. The room no longer followed his lead, it followed her rhythm, and that realization settled deep, heavier than any sound that had echoed before. Claire inhaled slowly, her shoulders barely rising, then exhaled, steady, controlled, and in that measured breath something aligned, something invisible yet exact. Her head tilted a fraction, her stance grounded, and then the 10th shot rang out, sharp and final, cutting cleanly through the silence before fading into it. And just like that, it was over, but no one moved, no one spoke. The room remained frozen as if the outcome required permission to exist. Claire lowered the firearm with the same calm precision she had carried from the beginning, her hands steady, her expression unreadable beneath the blindfold. And for a long second nothing happened. Brandon turned slowly, almost reluctantly, toward the target screens, his steps no longer confident, each one carrying a weight he could not ignore. A few others followed, drawn forward by the same need to see what none of them could yet accept. The screens flickered, a brief delay that stretched the tension tighter. And then the first lane lit up, perfect center, a clean, exact grouping. A quiet gasp escaped from somewhere behind. Then the second lane illuminated, identical, precise, undeniable. Another breath caught, another silence deepened. One by one the results revealed themselves, each target displaying the same impossible consistency. No deviation, no error, just perfect alignment. The room did not erupt. It collapsed inward, sound disappearing completely as realization took hold. Brandon stared at the screens, his expression frozen mid-thought, his mind racing to find an explanation that would restore the world to something familiar. But there was none, because what stood in front of him was not chance, not luck, not even exceptional skill in the way he understood it. This was something beyond his assumptions, something that did not need validation. Claire reached up and removed the blindfold slowly, her eyes adjusting to the light without urgency. She did not look at the screens first. She looked at him, her gaze steady, calm, and in that quiet exchange there was no triumph, no need to prove anything further, only certainty. Brandon opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words failed him, because every sentence he had prepared belonged to a version of this moment that no longer existed. Someone near the back finally whispered, barely audible, "Who is she?" And the question lingered in the air, unanswered, heavy with meaning. Claire placed the blindfold back on the counter, gently, as if returning something borrowed, then stepped back from the lane, her movements as simple as when she arrived. Yet everything about the room had changed, because now every eye followed her not with amusement, but with something else entirely, something closer to respect. And as Brandon stood there, silent, his confidence stripped down to its truth, one realization settled deeper than all the rest, that sometimes the person you dismiss in a moment is the very person who has already mastered everything you thought you understood. No one clapped, no one spoke. The silence stayed exactly where it had fallen, heavy and undeniable. Claire Whitman turned away from the lane as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if 10 perfect shots without sight were simply part of her routine. She reached for her bag, adjusting the strap over her shoulder with the same quiet precision that had defined every movement she made. Brandon Cole remained where he stood, eyes still locked on the glowing targets, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. distorted by something he had never expected to feel here. Uncertainty, the kind that does not fade quickly, the kind that forces a man to question not just what he saw, but who he believed himself to be. Someone behind him shifted, then another, the room slowly returning to motion, but not to what it had been before. Conversations did not resume the same way. Laughter did not come back. Instead, there were glances, quiet exchanges, subtle nods that carried a new understanding. One man stepped closer to the monitor, leaning in as if proximity might reveal a flaw. But there was none. Every mark remained exactly where it should be. Exact, centered, deliberate. Brandon finally exhaled, a breath he had been holding since the 7th shot. And when he turned, Claire was already walking toward the exit. Not fast, not slow, just steady, like someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere to rush. Wait. The word came out before he could stop it. Not loud, not commanding, just enough to reach her. She paused, but did not turn immediately, giving the moment space. Brandon stepped forward, each step measured now, stripped of the confidence he had worn so easily before. You did not even look, he said, the sentence incomplete, lacking the structure he was used to. Claire turned then, her expression calm, her eyes steady, not challenging, not soft, simply present. I did not need to, she replied, her voice quiet, but clear enough to settle into the space between them. Brandon searched her face for something more, an explanation, a hint, anything that would restore balance. But there was nothing offered beyond that simple truth. Someone behind him whispered again, "She has done this before." Another answered, "Not just before." A pause, many times. The realization spread without needing volume. Claire adjusted her jacket slightly, her posture unchanged, and for a brief second there was a glimpse of something deeper, not pride, not arrogance, but experience, the kind that does not announce itself because it does not need to. Brandon hesitated, then asked the question that had been forming since the moment the screens lit up. "Where did you learn that?" The room quieted again, not as sharply as before, but enough to hold the answer. Claire looked at him, her gaze steady, and for a moment it seemed like she might say more, might offer a story, a background, a piece of context that would make everything easier to understand. But instead she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Some places do not teach you to talk about it," she said softly. And with that, she turned, walking toward the door, the sound of her footsteps light against the floor, each one carrying her further from the moment that had changed the room. Brandon stood still, the question still lingering in his mind, unanswered in the way he had expected, but answered in every way that mattered. And as the door opened and closed behind her, letting in a brief wash of outside light before settling back into stillness, the room did not return to what it had been, because something had shifted permanently, not in the targets, not in the equipment, but in the people who had witnessed it, and in Brandon most of all, because for the first time in a long time, he understood something simple and difficult at once, that skill does not need recognition to exist, and that respect, real respect, is something you earn long before anyone is watching. The door had barely settled back into its frame when the room exhaled all at once, like a spell had quietly lifted, but something in the air refused to return to normal. Brandon Cole remained standing in the same spot, his eyes still fixed on the space where Claire Whitman had disappeared, not because he expected her to return, but because part of him had not yet caught up with what had just happened. The monitors behind him still glowed faintly, each perfect grouping frozen in place like evidence that could not be argued away. A younger man approached cautiously, glancing between the targets and Brandon. "You knew about that?" he asked, his voice low, careful. Brandon did not answer immediately. His jaw tightened slightly before he shook his head once, slow, deliberate. "No," he said, and the honesty in that single word carried more weight than anything he had said earlier that day. The man nodded, stepping back, unsure what else to say, because there was nothing to fix, nothing to correct, only something to accept. Brandon turned again toward the counter, his movements slower now, stripped of the casual ease he once carried. He picked up the blindfold she had left behind, running his fingers across the fabric as if it might explain something. But it did not. It was ordinary, simple, just like she had appeared, and that contrast settled deep. because everything extraordinary about her had existed beneath what anyone could see. Someone else spoke from behind. That kind of control. You do not just pick that up. Another voice added. That is years, maybe more. Brandon placed the blindfold back down gently, as if returning it to a place of respect rather than a prop for amusement. His eyes drifted once more to the targets. But this time he did not search for flaws. He knew there were none. Instead, he studied the precision, the consistency, the quiet discipline behind it. And in doing so, something shifted inside him, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough to be felt. The realization that skill like that does not need an audience, does not need approval. It exists. Regardless, built in silence, refined without recognition. He let out a slow breath, longer than the ones before, and for the first time since she had walked in, he allowed himself to acknowledge the truth without resistance. I misjudged her, he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But the words carried, and no one disagreed. The room had seen it, felt it, learned from it, in a way that did not require explanation. Outside, beyond the walls of the range, Claire Whitman walked. Across the parking lot, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the pavement, her steps steady, unhurried, as if the moment she had left behind held no weight on her at all. She reached her car, placing her bag inside before pausing briefly, her reflection faint in the window, calm, unchanged, as if nothing unusual had taken place, and perhaps to her, it had not, because what she carried was not meant for display, not meant for validation. It simply was. She closed the door, softly, and moved on, leaving behind a room full of people who would not forget what they had witnessed, and a man who would not forget what he had learned. Because sometimes the loudest lesson is delivered without a single raised voice, and the strongest presence is the one that never needed to prove itself in the first place. The range did not return to its usual rhythm that day. Even hours later, the conversations remained quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone who had witnessed that moment carried a piece of it with them. Brandon Cole found himself replaying it again and again, not the shots themselves, but everything leading up to them. The way Claire Whitman had walked in without hesitation, the way she had listened more than she spoke, the way she had accepted the challenge without needing to defend herself. It was not just what she did, it was how she did it. And that difference lingered, long after the sound had faded. He stood behind the counter, staring at the same blindfold she had left behind earlier. But now it felt different, no longer a prop for a joke, but a reminder, something that marked the exact moment his assumptions had failed him. A regular customer approached, placing a box of ammunition on the counter. That woman earlier, he began, his tone cautious. You ever seen anything like that before? Brandon shook his head slowly, not looking up right away. No, he said again. But this time the word carried a deeper meaning, not just unfamiliarity, but respect. The customer nodded, lingering for a moment as if expecting more, but there was nothing else to add, because what they had seen was not something easily explained or categorized. It simply existed, undeniable, as real as the targets still hanging at the far end of the lanes. Later that evening, as the crowd thinned and the range quieted, Brandon walked back toward the lanes alone, the overhead lights casting long reflections across the polished floor. He stopped in front of the same targets, now replaced with fresh ones, but the memory of the earlier patterns remained clear in his mind, precise, centered, unwavering. He reached out, adjusting the new paper slightly, then paused, his hand lingering for a second longer than necessary, as if the action itself held some meaning he had not yet fully grasped. The silence around him was different now, not empty, but reflective, and in that stillness, something settled into place, a quiet understanding that skill is not always visible, that mastery often hides behind simplicity, and that the loudest confidence is not always the strongest. Outside, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the parking lot bathed in soft, fading light. And somewhere beyond that, Claire Whitman continued her evening as if nothing unusual had happened. No calls, no messages, no need to revisit the moment, because for her, it had never been about proving anything to anyone. It had simply been another task completed with the same discipline she had carried for years. Back inside, Brandon turned off the last set of lights, the range settling into darkness one section at a time. And as he stood there, hand on the switch, he allowed himself one final thought, not of embarrassment, not of regret, but of clarity, the kind that arrives quietly, without announcement, that sometimes the people who say the least have already done the most, and that respect is not something you demand in a moment, but something you recognize when it stands right in front of you, even if it takes losing control to finally see it. The next morning arrived quietly, but the memory of what had happened did not fade with the night. It settled, deeper, carried forward into the small details of a new day. Brandon Cole unlocked the range earlier than usual, the metal door echoing softly as it opened, the empty space inside greeting him with a stillness that felt different from before, not empty, but reflective, as if the walls themselves held on to what they had witnessed. He moved through the routine motions without thinking, turning on lights, checking lanes, aligning equipment, but his mind remained elsewhere, replaying not just the outcome, but the moments in between, the pauses, the silence, the certainty that had defined Claire Whitman's presence. It was not the perfection that stayed with him the most. It was the calm, the complete absence of doubt, something he realized he had never truly understood before. As the first customers began to arrive, the usual sounds returned gradually, conversations, footsteps, the low hum of activity. But there was a subtle shift in the way people spoke, a restraint, a thoughtfulness that had not been there before. A man at the counter asked about lane availability, then hesitated before adding, "That woman yesterday, you think she will come back?" Brandon looked up, meeting his eyes briefly, then shook his head slightly. "I do not know," he answered, and it was the truth, because someone like her did not move according to expectations, did not return for recognition or validation. She simply existed on her own terms. The man nodded, stepping away, but the question lingered, not just for him, but for everyone who had been there. Throughout the morning, small conversations echoed the same curiosity, not loud, not intrusive, but present, like a quiet thread running through the day. Brandon found himself listening more than speaking, observing the way others carried themselves, noticing the difference between those who performed confidence and those who held it quietly. And for the first time, he saw it clearly, the gap between appearance and reality, between assumption and truth. Around midday, he stepped back into the lanes, watching a group of regulars practice, their movements familiar, their routines unchanged. But even here, something subtle had shifted. There was less noise, less unnecessary commentary, more focus, more intention. As if the room itself had learned something it could not unlearn, he walked to the far end, standing where the targets aligned. And for a moment, he imagined the pattern again. 10 perfect marks, each one placed without sight, without hesitation, and instead of disbelief, he felt something else now, something steadier, a recognition of what it took to reach that level. The years, the discipline, the unseen effort. Later, as the afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting long lines across the floor, Brandon returned to the counter, his movements grounded, deliberate, not because he had changed overnight, but because something had shifted in how he saw the world. And in that shift, a quiet understanding took root, that respect is not given based on what you see in a moment, but on what someone has built long before you ever meet them. And as the day continued, one simple truth remained, unspoken but present in every glance and every pause, that sometimes the most important lesson does not come from winning or losing, but from realizing just how little you understood before the moment changed everything. Days passed, but the story did not fade. It settled into the quiet corners of memory, resurfacing in small moments when no one expected it. Brandon Cole found himself changing in ways he could not easily explain, not in what he did, but in how he saw. Every new person who walked through the door no longer felt like a quick judgment waiting to happen, but a question, one that deserved patience before an answer. The range continued to operate. Customers came and went, routines repeated, but beneath it all there was a difference, subtle, steady, like a current that had shifted direction without noise. One afternoon, a young woman stepped inside, hesitant, unsure, her steps slower than the others. Brandon noticed her immediately, not because she stood out loudly, but because she carried that same quiet presence he had once misunderstood. For a brief moment, the old instinct returned, the quick assumption, the easy label, but it did not stay. He caught it, held it, and let it pass. Instead, he stepped forward, his voice calm, respectful. "Let me know if you need anything," he said, and the difference in those words was not in their meaning, but in their intention. The woman nodded, visibly more at ease. And in that simple exchange, something completed itself, a lesson learned not through explanation, but through experience. Later that evening, as the range settled into its quieter hours, Brandon stood once again near the lanes, the soft hum of the buildings surrounding him, and for a moment, he allowed himself to revisit that day, not with confusion, not with disbelief, but with clarity. He no longer needed to understand every detail of Claire Whitman's past. He did not need a title, a history, or a confirmation, because what mattered had already been revealed in the way she carried herself, in the way she acted without needing acknowledgement, in the way she left without looking back. And in that understanding, something grounded took hold. The realization that true skill, true discipline, true strength, they do not announce themselves. They do not seek validation. They exist quietly, waiting for the moment when they are simply needed, nothing more, nothing less. Outside, the sky darkened slowly, the last light fading across the horizon, and somewhere beyond the reach of that building, Claire Whitman continued her life, unchanged, unseen, and entirely complete. In its own way, the world did not shift for her, because it never needed to. She had already built everything she carried long before that moment existed. Back inside, Brandon turned off the final set of lights, the room dimming into stillness, and as he stood there, he understood something that would stay with him long after the memory itself softened. That respect is not something you decide to give when it is convenient. It is something you learn to recognize, even when it challenges everything you thought you knew. And sometimes, the people who teach you that lesson will never return. They will simply pass through, leave their mark, and disappear, leaving behind a truth that cannot be undone. And that day, in that quiet range, the world did not just witness skill, it witnessed dignity in its purest form, unspoken, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. Respect often reveals itself when you least expect it. If you enjoy stories that uncover truth, dignity, and hidden strength, do not forget to like and subscribe. The next story might just change the way you see the world. Thank you so much for watching.